Hey everyone. Does anyone know why some people can join directly, some other people are showing as that I need to admit them? This is kind of strange that.
I also thought it's my personal Zoom settings, but yeah, it doesn't happen all the time. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Because every now and then I see sometimes I have to approve somebody to enter. I need to check maybe there's something in the meeting settings. Great. I think we can start. Thanks everyone for joining this sync up on the bounded context working group. Today is February 5th. And so I just have a like announcement. So I added more color formatting to the feature category column so we can distinguish a bit more like shared and ignore and some kind of to-dos, just to have a way of highlighting things that we want to dig a little bit further or things we simply want to ignore. But the idea will be that, I think at least things like shared, eventually we might need to look at with a bit more attention to understand, is this some kind of a gems, for example, that needs to be extracted, or it's something that needs to be formalized more into some kind of a platform module. But yeah, any thoughts about that? Cool. So I think the next steps that I was thinking for this working group is that as we continue with categorizing the directories, the next goal will be that start thinking about a potential list of namespaces that we want to kind of formalize into a list of bounded contexts, so that we can say, okay, can we have a list we can enforce things? So we say, we have these are our bounded contexts. If you want to create, a new one, maybe there's like a process, or there we want to have maybe a Robocop there that will highlight that it needs to be one of this list, or otherwise we need to register a new bounded context, whenever it makes sense. But I have a way that we can start to at least like a potentially move forwards with joining other bounded contexts together or splitting them up, and have a kind of a view of what that might look like. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. It might not be straightforward. There might be scenarios where we might not want to merge them, merge bounded contexts together, or in the certain cases where it makes sense. But yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
I have a counter example to perhaps move code into like unified code in a as category namespace. So for example, we in the past in the monitor group, we had two feature categories called incident management and alert management. And they were, before that, they were like two different categories, but then the category was consolidated, but the namespaces actually remained. So I wonder how we would go about like feature category consolidation, meaning now looking in the code, I clearly can see where the alert management feature is living in, right? And because it's still called alert management. But if we were, for example, if we would have started with a single feature category incident management, perhaps we no longer would have the distinction between alert management and other features of incident management, unless we are starting adding like nested namespaces, right? So incident management, alert management, which gets like very mouthful, I would say, and perhaps not precise. So I'm not sure. So I just wanted to provide a counterexample. I don't dislike the idea in general, but I feel like we need to pay attention to details, or like we cannot generalize like the approach.
Yes, that makes sense.
Sorry, quickly, I will add a little bit on top of this. I had exactly the same example in mind, and on top of alerts management and incident management, we also have on-call schedule, which is they all combined under incident manager category. But I think it's mostly like a business decision of how, like organizational structure, how it call these features. And that's why we end up in the same category, but we're sort of different features. So yeah, it's just on top of what Peter said.
But when we look at, a macro level, at GitLab level, are these features related to the same context? Do they share some contextual information, for example?
We work together. So for example, when we receive alert, we can create incident and it can trigger like on-call notification, but we also can be considered as separate features.
For example, so maybe a similar example that I can describe is like working with CI code base. We have this big CI namespace, but in reality, inside it, there's a lot of feature categories. Some of these make sense to be together because there's like a lot of shared in knowledge, like what the pipeline is, what a build is. Maybe some of the sub-concepts could be extracted into a separate category, like we have secret management, for example, as a feature category. And secret management in this case is related to maybe pipeline variables and tokens and things like that. So maybe part of it could be like like a separate bounded context. But when we look at the overall GitLab size, it makes sense for some of these feature categories to be grouped together because there is like some shared understanding. They have a shared understanding. It's not entirely separate, like what secure scanning, for example, is with the pipeline. Even though that there is like some relation there, but it's more like a dependencies. Like secure scanning needs some information about the pipeline, but not vice versa. But if I would say that maybe kind of a guideline will be like, if you find yourself having two-way relationship, two-way dependencies between these two feature categories, it's a sign that maybe they need to be merged together. So in that case, if it is like incident management and alert management, if you find yourself in a dependency graph that these two needs each other, then it's a sign that maybe there is like some kind of bounded context that needs to be emerged from both of them, and where these things they have like shared understanding. If there's like a one-way relationship, maybe it's like a sign that okay, these two things are different. There's like a very specific dependency direction, but they're actually different.
I guess if they cannot coexist without each other, then it should be separate, or should be the same thing, sir.
Yeah, was what I wrote down. So we can work together, as I mentioned. An alert can be triggered if something broke on somewhere on external server. It will create an incident and will notify a person who is on call. But at the same time, you can use incidents independently of anything. So you can create incident without involving alerts and without notify anyone else. So in this case, incidents looks like a separate feature. And I think don't remember already, but I think we can receive alerts, but don't do anything, don't create incidents, but I'm not sure now. Yeah, so, but
Okay.
it's this one separate example. I don't know about all other namespaces and how they work.
Yeah, and I think, as we said, that the feature category is not the ultimate rule we have to use. It's more like a starting point. And if it makes sense to have smaller bounded context, and then or if it makes sense to, so in certain cases, to merge multiple bounded contexts together, we don't have to have all big bounded context everywhere. There could be perfectly case scenario where some of them might be smaller than other ones, and we can refine this process over time. I don't think we need to have the answers. We can still refine this over time. So maybe we could, like, what about we keep the features separate unless we have like a strong argument on joining them, for example, if that makes sense, if that is also more in line with how the code works today, and how the code is organized today. So if the two things like incident management and alert management are already separate, have separate namespaces, and we can leave them as is. If they are also part of separate feature categories, we can leave them separate. But then if in the future we see there is an argument for grouping them under bounded context, we can still do that. Also, like having on them under bounded context, it doesn't mean that the two things become the same thing. So it can still be separate submodule with their own sub-concepts. But if we put them under the same bounded context, it means that the language we are using within that namespace is somehow shared across these two sub-concepts. So it doesn't necessarily mean we are going to remove that distinction between the two features. So I'm thinking in this case also, like for CI, does it make sense to have, the breakdown? So we still have CI, like maybe overall, since it's the way the whole code is organized today, but maybe some concepts can be CI artifacts and have its own, since it's artifacts is a feature category on its own. CI secrets could be like a separate category on its own, but they're still part of the biggest bounded context that is CI, since there is a shared language that these modules share. So it makes sense to be them under the same bounded context. Bounded context is a lot about what language and terminology we use, and whether the term makes sense within that context. But then within, I don't know, merge request bounded context means something slightly different. So we might want to have that kind of distinction of terminology within a specific bounded context. So in that case, if the concept or alert or incident is the same, across these different feature categories, it can make sense for them to be under the same bounded context, but separate submodules.
How granular do we want to go? I'm asking that because there's a trade-off. If we go too granular, we start losing all the efficiencies, because then we have I don't know, 300 triggered builds and everything else. How far do we want to go?
Yeah, I don't have the answer at the moment. I think it depends on how, on the various of the various aspects we want to leverage from modularization. And it's also true that currently we're looking at a top level bounded context, which is not the only way of breaking down. It's be more like the macro aspects of the application, but inside each bounded context, there could be multiple modules, and each of them can have their own separate owners even, if we want to do that. So it could be maybe separate packages, if we were going to use Packwork, for example. But the bounded context is a way of macro organizing concepts. So it will not be just all those as top level modules would be the containers, let's say. Like it will be just a way of organizing macro concepts. So I think ultimately what will be important is what will be the total number of modules we're going to have, whether they are organized at top level or considering the sub concepts. But at the moment, we just want to focus on the top level, just to make have an understanding of architecture of GitLab that can be encoded in bounded context. So I think it's like we might not have the answers today, but it's more like an ongoing process. So we can start with what makes also sense based on trade-offs. Like we don't want to rename thousands of classes today. Maybe it makes sense to keep some of them as is. As long as we say, okay, we make this a bounded context. We put in a list of recognized bounded context. And if something new is introduced, then we kind of have to vet it, like register this as a new bounded context, or we just flag it. And I think we can iterate from there. We can split things over time and create two separate entries or join them together if things make sense. I think we still have a lot to learn there, and maybe learning from the various use cases. And I think the devil is in the details. So where the more use cases we find and we discuss, the more we can have like a better guidelines.
Should we aim for a certain number of contexts or containers or modules or whatever we call it? We don't have to decide that yet, but let's say that we pick a number and try to more or less reach that number. And that can give us like at least an idea of size or how we're going to combine things, other than to be too open-ended.
I don't know. I would be worried that we, kind of as an organization, we tend to try to match the number and not looking at the responsibilities of each bounded context. Because I think like if there is like a bounded context that is a lot of this responsibility are very closely related to each other, and just there's a lot of features about it. Maybe let's say CI, it makes sense for that bounded context to be big. But then if we have smaller features that are actually very independent, very kind of isolated, it might make sense for those to be like very small in certain cases. I think in general it's good to have like deeper modules. So like smaller interface and deeper module with a lot of private concepts in general is good design, but we need to look at what are the features of our code base. And so I would say we can look into having a kind of an initial draft based on in the categorization spreadsheet. Actually, we have the list of feature categories. They're aggregated. We can start to look at those and see like how many unique feature categories we have there in the code, and is there like a match between the feature category and the actual namespace, and we can see okay how many namespaces we can end up having, and from there we say okay we have 30 namespaces. Does it look fine? Do all these look like they can be independent, like at least like isolated features? Then I think it's a good number as a start. I don't know. What do you think about that?
My idea was more like, let's say that we pick some random numbers like 10, 30, 50, and 200. We want to eat more into the 200 lines, more into the 50, 30, or 10, because those are very different approaches. Like 10 will be lean more into like the plan, manage, enablement type of categorization. And if you go more to the 200s, it will be much more granular.
Yeah, I would say that I think if we start from a feature category, the number should be kind of around the number of feature categories we have today, more or less. Could be 10 less, 10 more, depending on how we prefer to group things. But I think that might be like a good starting point, because then we might end up having, if we go higher than that, we might have namespaces that don't represent the full feature categories. It might be like a facets of the feature category, and it will be hard to distinguish there. Like what are we talking about exactly? It's like let's say we have labels, something like called labels. Is this like issue labels? Is something like labels for CI? Something like a slightly different. So it starts to become this is why then I think bounded context becomes important, because the bounded context creates like a circle around basically the terminology that is being used. So if we go to smaller as a number, then we have maybe inflated bounded context where there's like a lot inside it, and it's hard to understand what are all the features inside this. So I would say like we can keep the number. Maybe I can go back to understand what's the number of unique feature categories we have, to understand roughly what the number we might expect to have. Yeah, and then from there we can join things together, we can split them up, and depending on what we think makes more sense.
I wanted to add a little bit about the source code management. I took a look and I realized that we have a lot, and we have lots of different things that kind of go under the source code management team responsibilities, but they are so different. So I was wondering if it actually makes sense to have this bounded context for all of them, or it's better to split them. So let's say as an example, we have repository, a mirroring of repositories, like approval rules. What else? Protected branches. These concepts, kind of like LFS files, these concepts are pretty different from one another, and feels like it's better to keep like LFS files separately from the approval rules. Like having this kind of like umbrella on top of them, I'm not sure if it will make lots of sense. Plus, I think the structure of the team might change over the time, and it will force us to also update it if you have it under source code and it move to a new team, for example. So yeah, what do you think about that?
I think LFS and Gitly as two close together but completely separate examples are a good one. Even though they are part of Git, it's still completely different things.
Agree.
And all of them, are they marked as source code management feature category, or like they have like some kind of sub features somehow?
Currently, it's all under the source code management. It's like, I think it's more than from the feature perspective. So the team only handles the one feature category, but in reality, I think it's more than one, and it should be like split it into the multiple ones.
Mm-hmm.
So I would expect to have like more than one bounded context for the source code team.
This is interesting, because I think this resembles a lot like CI. We have the continuous integration feature category, which is basically the everything else of CI that is not pipeline authoring or build artifact. It's basically everything else is within continuous integration, and it contains everything from creating a pipeline to processing a pipeline, scheduling pipelines, even concepts that are very different from each other. They are part of the same big kind of feature category, and it's shared actually across multiple teams, because this concept there. So while the feature category is assigned to a specific team, the code that is mapped to as multiple teams working on it. So I think we need to mark some cases like this to understand we can have like a bounded context where actually multiple teams are working on. And I think it's fine. It doesn't necessarily have to be one bounded context, one team. I think it's fine. As long as it's not like nobody owns this or it's very kind of difficult to understand who owns this. Having like shared ownership within a small number of teams, I think is still fine. But yeah, I can see this relating a lot to CI in terms of use case. So we can look for ways we can align this a little bit more with ownership and feature categories.
Yeah, makes sense to me. I think CI is kind of like a pretty good explanation of the whole thing. For the source code management, I kind of having troubles to find like a single word that explains like all of these like things to make it like actually making sense. This term that can be like explaining all of these parts. So, but yeah, maybe not a single one, but a few of them might be like a few bounded context might explain everything that goes under it.
Yeah. And I would say at the moment it's not super important that one bounded context needs to map to one team, but it's more like let's try to have a better understanding of the team to code ownership, and yeah, we can refine it from there. I know we are at time, and is there anything else people want to bring up? Cool. So I am going to, so we can continue the exercise there, and next time we can look into the relationship, maybe how we could translate like feature category based on how we are categorizing the code to a bounded context. And we can, yeah, maybe I was thinking maybe we could add another column to the agenda, to the spreadsheet, where we can say, okay, this is the feature category, and this is could be maybe the candidate bounded context we can have. Some it could be just reusing the same module that exists today, or it could be like a new candidate. And doesn't have to be something like, okay, from now on, let's rename everything immediately. We can still discuss about that, but we're doing this kind of exploration. How does it look?
Right. So currently the exercise is to identify the feature category in the code base based upon the folder structure. Is that what we are doing with the help of this spreadsheet, right?
Yeah, we still continue with that. What we're
Okay.
gonna do next is, as we assign a feature category, we can say, okay, we have this, for example, package metadata module, and that belongs to package registry. Which namespace should this actually be? Are they all going to be under, let's say, packages, bounded context? Then we put, okay, we would like to have this into packages, and then we can see there like how many namespaces we have today for a specific feature category, and are we going to reduce those or split them into multiple top level namespace ideally. So this is kind of I think the goal of this is to understand what patterns we can extract from this.
Yes.
And yeah, that we can document.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Anything else? That's good. We can wrap it up then. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.